I now want to introduce our second speaker, Daniella Kostroun, Professor of History at the University of Indiana, Purdue at Indianapolis, incoming President of the Society, by the way, and who will therefore be chairing next year's meeting at Indianapolis. She graduated initially from Cornell and then with a PhD from Duke University. Specializes in religious and social history, history of women in 17th and 18th century France. A major work, a really major work, I think, too, not just simply a work that you produce in the course of a career. Feminism, Absolutism and Jansenism, which is a study of the defiance of the nuns of the famous Abbey of Port-Royal against the persecution of during the age of Louis the XIV. Daniella is now working on, having spent a year in Nantes, the Institute for Advanced Study in Nantes, which is a recent institution which is not necessarily terribly well known. Its existence is not terribly well known so far, but it is a great place to actually be a researcher, I think, and she will agree with me. We always agree on these things. And Nantes is a particularly useful place to be when it comes to studying transatlantic history and connections between, both sides of the Atlantic, which is what Daniella is working on at the moment. Networks of influence in the French Atlantic, as I understand it. And her paper today is, focused on an important figure from an earlier period, so the mid-17th century, Salle, Cavalier de la Salle, who was an important figure in the exploration of North America. So Daniella, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So my paper is titled The Jesuit Career of René Robert Cavalier de la Salle. Before he became an explorer in North America, René Robert Cavalier de la Salle had been a member of the Jesuit order in France. Born to a merchant family from Rouen in 1642, La Salle took his vows as a Jesuit novice at the age of 14. He remained in the Jesuit order for 8 years until he left the order and moved to New France in 1667. La Salle's Jesuit career has long been shrouded in mystery. The first hint of his Jesuit past came from a comment made by the Recollet priest and fellow explorer Louis Hennepin in a 1698 publication. However, given La Salle's well-known animosity towards the Jesuits and Hennepin's lack of credibility as an author, many readers doubted Hennepin's claims. It was not until 1806 when the Jesuit historian Camille de Rochemontet cited Jesuit records in Les Jésuites de la Nouvelle-France au XVIIe siècle that La Salle's Jesuit past was confirmed. In addition to confirming La Salle's Jesuit past, Rochemontet also asserted that all of La Salle's traits and characteristics as an explorer were already evident during his Jesuit years. For example, he cited teachers' reports in the Jesuit archives describing La Salle as, quote, proud, impressionable, stubborn, domineering, and hot-tempered. Rochemontet's statement sought to settle the question on the long-standing debates about La Salle and his legacy. Few explorers have been as controversial as La Salle. For some, he was a great explorer who would have established the first colony in Mississippi had he not been betrayed and murdered by his own men. For others, he was a mentally unstable man, one whose temperament and unpredictable behavior brought on his own demise. What can we learn about La Salle when we look at his life through the lens of his Jesuit past? In this paper, I agree with Rochemontet that La Salle's Jesuit days provided important insights into his life as an explorer. Even though La Salle had left the clergy by the time he became an explorer, his experience as a cleric continued to shape his actions and writings. We see this enduring influence when we examine La Salle's critiques of the Jesuits in Canada. These critiques were grounded in religious polemics involving Jesuits from his native Normandy. La Salle knew about these debates because they took place while he was studying in the Jesuit College of Rouen. In short, if we want to better understand La Salle, the explorer, we need to understand his clerical identity. And the title of this panel is Clerical Identities, which was part of Mita's particular focus. So I did a little research on what is meant by clerical identity. And what I found is that the current research tends to fall into two categories, two areas of emphasis. A first area of emphasis has been the lens of gender. This emphasis derives from the Catholic Church's embrace of celibacy as a condition that sets the clergy apart from the rest of the population. And for women, celibacy intersects quite seamlessly with positive classical ideals of female heroic virtue and self-sacrifice. But for men, celibacy was more problematic, since ideals of masculinity were often tied to virility and sexual reproduction. So the potential for celibacy to emasculate male clerics and thus reduce their social prestige presented a unique challenge that male clerics responded to in a variety of ways. And there's several publications along this theme, particularly in the medieval period. A second area of emphasis is tied to the process of confessionalization, meaning the fixing of religious beliefs into set denominations. As the lines hardened between different confessions during the wars of religion, the clergy were seen as the front line in the war against heresy. Scholars studying clerical identity in the context of confessionalization tend to see the clergy as the workforce of confessional societies under construction. Their work in reform, in increased self-discipline, educational innovations help to create a new profile for the clergy, one that we might call a professional identity. When we look at Salles' clerical identity through his own writings, the evidence lends itself to an analysis of his clerical identity through this professional confessional lens. The first set of writings that we have for him are the letters he sent to the Superior General of the Jesuit order, petitioning to become a missionary in China. These letters were his job application, so to speak, and we compare his writings with those of other Jesuits, we see that he was not a very strong candidate. The second set of writings are the letters and reports he sent to his sponsors in France when he was exploring the Mississippi Valley. In these writings, he had to defend himself against negative reports that the Jesuits were spreading about him in Paris. Although Salles was no longer a cleric at this time, his self-defense was grounded in a confessional debate between Jansenists and Jesuits in Normandy, and Salles took the Jansenist side in his letter and borrowed from their arguments to defend himself against the Jesuit accusations. So I'm now going to look at these two sets of letters. So I'm going to start with Salles' petitions to go to China, which he wrote as a Jesuit. Salles became a student at the Jesuit College of Rouen in 1652 at the age of 9. At the age of 14, in 1658, he moved to Paris to start his novitiate. He took his first simple vows on October 10, 1660, and then went to the Collège Henri IV at La Flèche to study for the priesthood. He taught grammar at Jesuit schools in Tours and at Blois. And from Blois, and starting in March 1666, on March 28, 1666, he sends his first letter to Giovanni Paolo Oliva, the Superior General of the Jesuits in Rome, asking to be sent to China to finish preparing for his ordination. He repeated his request 2 more times over the year of 1666-1667. However, each time his request was rejected. He sends a final letter in January of 1667 requesting his release from the order. And we do not know exactly why Salles leaves the Jesuit order, but the timing suggests that it's tied to his failure to become a missionary. Salles' letters petitioning for China are the best sources that we have for him. There's 3 letters, and they offer insight into his personal life and allow us to compare him with other Jesuits seeking to go on mission. Salles was one of hundreds of French Jesuits who petitioned the Superior General in the 17th and 18th centuries, asking to be sent on mission all over the world. Known as the Indipati, the request for the Indies, so that was the main place people wanted to go, the East, Jesuit candidates composed these letters as personal appeals to the general as a father, detailing their vocation and suitability for missionary work. While personal in nature, the letters contain standard information about the candidate's qualifications, their age, level of studies, language skills, health, etc. They also contained narratives about their spiritual development and underscored their vocation for missionary work. The French scholar Amélie Vintar's study of the French Identities allows us to compare Lassalle's letters with those of his peers. We see that he was typical in many ways. For instance, in his first Indipita of March 28, 1666, Lassalle detailed his skills and qualifications. Quote, "I have a very good training in mathematics. I have, too, a ready and retentive memory for languages. Spanish I knew even before my entrance into the society, and I am fairly well versed in Arabic and Hebrew." He also discussed his health. Quote, "I am large and robust of body, and in particular and capable to a high degree of enduring heat and cold." His one health concern was kidney stones. Quote, "I am in imminent danger of stone." Lassalle then used his risk for kidney stones to justify his choice for China. Quote, "The doctors say I can escape kidney stones only by getting to China rather quickly, as the climate there is very agreeable. I would petition with a like attraction for the other missions also, were it not that the doctors pronounce them distinctly bad for the disease which threatens me." Well, this was not very convincing, apparently. Vantard notes that many of those seeking to go abroad did so early in their careers, soon after they finished the novitiate and before they completed their studies for the priesthood. Lassalle mentions in his first Indipita that he was still studying for the priesthood and hoped that he could finish while in China. He had been wanting to go to China ever since he started his novitiate in 1658. Quote, "For 8 full years, which is ever since my entrance into the society, I have ever been desiring and petitioning with the greatest eagerness for admission into China." Lassalle finally wrote the general for permission because of the, quote, "unrelenting pressure of God's call." This long-held desire for China, which Lassalle attributed to God's will, raises the question of his vocation. Vantard notes that the petitioners typically describe their vocation as a desire, zeal, that is placed in them by God beyond their own will. To describe this vocation, the Indipitae writers included narratives of their spiritual development that imitated the tropes and motifs found in earlier Jesuit writings, such as the spiritual exercise of Loyola or the biographies of famous missionaries. Lassalle's letter diverges from this general pattern. Aside from mentioning that a trip to China would, quote, refresh my languishing soul, he provided no narrative of how his vocation for missionary work emerged, nor did he express his hopes for spiritual growth through the missionary experience, another common theme in Indipita letters. Instead, Lassalle's letter focused on the themes that appeared in the Jesuit missionary propaganda read in college refectories across France. These announcements stressed the material needs of the mission by highlighting the small scale of the Jesuit missions compared to the enormous population and size of Asia. Lassalle's first Indipita addressed this problem pragmatically. Quote, "The land in question, China, is badly in need of money and subsidies. Means will be at my disposal by which I can come to its relief at the rate of 600 livres a year."
China problems.
Yes, we'll solve China's problems. Lassalle's second letter of April 5th, 1666, suggests that doubt about his zeal was cited in the refusal to his first request. He wrote, quote, "I pledge myself so to acquit myself of the charge in question, that no one will find me lacking on the score of zeal or efficiency, if only after some years I be allowed to go to China." He then proposed a transfer to Portugal as a preliminary step towards reaching China, because all the missionaries for China left through Portugal. However, again, rather than mentioning any spiritual motives, Lassalle again focused on the question of finances. "Traveling expenses will be met as often as necessary by my parents, who will also contribute 8,000 livres to the Chinese mission." Again, Lassalle's petition is turned down. It is not until the third letter of December 1st, 1666, that Lassalle incorporated a narrative of spiritual development into his petition. Lassalle asked to go to Portugal to teach mathematics. In addition to citing finances, quote, "I shall pay my traveling expenses through my parents and give that exceedingly poor mission 500 livres a year." So he's still focusing on the money. But after describing his hope he also describes his hopes for personal redemption through missionary work. After referring to certain misdeeds that may have impeded his earlier requests, Salles stressed that sacrificing himself abroad would be the only way to, quote, fulfill the vow which I made to God with the approval of my superiors. And he goes on to say, quote, I therefore suppliantly beg your paternity to give me a share in those precious chains which are said to weigh on hours in China, and not suffer me to lead a useless life when so many people are daily falling prey to demons. Souls perhaps to be rescued from their hands by my blood, if God is going to grant me so great a favor. Let only your paternity command me to be off, alone and a beggar, to desert wastes. So great is my confidence in the divine goodness that not even the prospect of death itself will cause me to make the least delay. This desire for martyrdom was a common theme in the Identities letters by Jesuits who sought to convince the general by modeling themselves on famous missionaries, particularly Francis Xavier in the Asian context, and those other ones that were boiled in kettles mentioned yesterday in Devarat's talk. Salles also applied a common theme found in Identities letters when he compared Asia to a desert waste. Many candidates compared Asia to the desert of the early church fathers to stress their belief that missionary work would help them detach themselves from the world and to embrace the religious life more perfectly. Salles only began including these typical motifs in his letters after having them rejected multiple times, well, twice. With the benefit of hindsight, it suggests that Salles' greater conformity to Jesuit narratives of missionary work and martyrdom may not have marked his full submission to Jesuit authority and cultural norms. In fact, it looks like it's his last-ditch effort to get accepted into the mission. On January 10th, 1667, he sent a letter requesting to be released from his vows after being rejected the third time. In describing Salles' request to leave the Jesuit order, Rochemonte, the Jesuit historian, attributed his reasons to, quote, moral infirmities. Rochemonte writes, in this request, Cavalier exposed at length the motives that made him determined to leave the order where he had lived for many years. He opened his soul entirely to his superior general and did not hide any of his moral infirmities. This is Rochemonte's description of Salles' letter of January 10, 1667. But since the letter remains yet to be seen by any other historian, we cannot confirm Rochemonte's description of its contents. So now I want to turn to the next letter source that I have by Salles, which are letters that he wrote as an explorer. After this last Identities letter, there are very few writings by Salles of any substance. Aside from some legal contracts and a few business letters, there are very few writings that provide insights into his thoughts, feelings, or personality. One exception are the letters and reports that Salles sent to his agent in Paris, the Abbé Bernoux, in 1681. Salles had received the patent letter granting him permission to explore the Mississippi River in 1678. He left on his journey with an expectation that he would send Bernoux regular reports on his activities. Unfortunately for Bernoux, Salles sent only one package of reports in August of 1681 describing his expedition down the Mississippi and into Illinois territory. And this is nearly 2 years after he left on his trip. The 2-year gap in communication from Salles was tantamount to failure of the expedition from the perspective of Bernoux, who waited anxiously for news in Paris. Bernoux sent a letter to Salles in early 1680 conveying his anxiety to Salles, an anxiety that he says is being exacerbated by negative reports about Salles that are being spread by the Jesuits in Paris. Among other things, the Jesuits were reporting that Salles was mentally unstable and prone to visions. Salles responded to Bernoux on August 22, 1681, in a letter that he sent in a packet with reports describing his travels for the past 2 years. Salles knew that his long silence had made him suspect in Bernoux's opinion. He thus stressed his commitment to letter writing and detailed all the misfortunes and accidents that had prevented earlier letters from reaching Bernoux. Salles also defended his character against the claim that he was mentally unstable. And it's in this defense that we see a reference to his Jesuit past. Salle wrote to Bernoulli, quote, "It is necessary that I prove to you that I am not crazy." He pointed out to Bernoulli that Bernoulli had observed his sanity for himself, quote, "In the long periods that we saw each other, you had the chance to know me, and for which it was necessary that I had good intervals that lasted for a long time." And what is interesting here is that in stating that he had good intervals of mental health, Salle appears to admit that he suffered from bad episodes. Why would Salle concede that he might have bad intervals of mental health? In the subsequent passage, we see that he did so in order to highlight the irony behind the Jesuits' accusations against him. This irony lies in a Jesuit controversy from his youth in Rouen involving the Jesuits in the nearby city of Caen. So he goes on to say, quote, "I think that those who speak of me in this way believe that the only people of sound mind are the illuminaries of the Hermitage of Caen or the Association of Bagotists, for whom they have been given the false notion that they are wise and virtuous men. But if they were not more chimerical than I, chimérique is the word in French, then people would never have been obligated to do against them all that was done in Lower Normandy before they came here to trouble Canada." So the background here, the Hermitage was a center for retreat and reflection established by a religious confraternity in Caen and was under the direction of Jesuit mystics. This group also helped to sponsor the Jesuit missions in Canada. And the Hermitage in 1654 becomes a flashpoint for the debates between the Jansenists of Port Royal and the Jesuits after a Rouen priest named Charles Dufour circulated reports describing the Hermitage as fostering a witch hunt against Jansenists in a nearby hamlet outside of Caen. A group of young men in this hamlet began denouncing members of their community as Jansenists. The local magistrate quickly intervened to stop the denunciations and to stop them from spreading. Port Royal's apologists accused the Jesuits of the Hermitage of being, quote, visionaries who impressed upon the weak minds of the young men a belief in a phantom heresy of Jansenism. And Pierre Nicole, one of these apologists, further developed this argument in his 10 Lettres sur les récits imaginaires, and then 8 follow-up letters called Les Visionnaires. So these are well-known Jansenist pamphlets by Nicole on this theme that comes out of this debate in Caen. By using the term illuminé, Salle was adopting one of the terms that polemicists such as Dufour and Nicole were used against the Hermitage mystics in Caen, saying that they deceived people. So in his letter to Bernoulli, Salle then goes on to say, as I said earlier, that if the men of the Hermitage had not been more chimerical, i.e. prone to visions than he, Salle, then such a controversy would never have erupted in Lower Normandy. So if Salle conceded that the Jesuits were right about his mental instability, he did so ironically, and to underscore that the Jesuits were the one prone to visions, and that perhaps even once upon a time, during his tenure as a Jesuit, he had suffered from their delusions. But now that he was stable for the most part, and reminding Bernoulli that the Jesuits of Caen were known for being chimerical, Salle also cautioned Bernoulli not to fall prey to their deception. He ended this section with the advice that Bernoulli should not believe these Jesuits without further evidence. Quote, "What they say should not make an impression on you as long as you have nothing in particular to point to that indicates my mismanagement of my friend's interests." Salle thus incorporated the terms of a well-known debate among clerics from his native Normandy in his defense of his mental health. Salle would have known about these debates because they erupted in 1654, 2 years after he began attending the Jesuit College of Rouen, and the same year that Jean de Brissacier became the college's rector. Brissacier had distinguished himself in his anti-Jansenist polemics and had been appointed rector in Rouen to help combat Jansenism in the region. And when Blaise Pascal, another resident of Rouen, began publishing the provincial letters in 1656, Brissacier petitioned the Archbishop of Rouen to have the letters censored. And Salle's provincial letters talk about that controversy at Caen as well. Salle encouraged the students at the Jesuit college to follow these debates and had the Jesuit response to Pascal's letters, the Apologie pour les casuistes contre les calomnies des jansénistes by the Father Pirot, read aloud in the refectory during their meals in 1657. So engaging with the Jansenist-Jesuit conflict had been part of Lassalle's education at the Jesuit College of Rouen. He appears to have later used this training to turn the tables against his Jesuit critics. So let me now turn, and by way of a conclusion, to what I see as the implications of looking at Lassalle through the lens of his clerical identity. Lassalle has been a difficult person to study because of a lack of sources. Most of what we know about him comes from accounts by others. These accounts, in turn, are partisan and contain multiple inconsistencies and contradictions. And for this reason, historians of Lassalle have focused on his own writings, and here it's really very little, just those Jesuit letters and his letter to Bernoux. So they are particularly precious as sources for Lassalle. And when we look at these writings as a whole, the main theme that unites them is Lassalle's Jesuit past. I believe that switching our focus from Lassalle the explorer to Lassalle the cleric will improve our understanding of him. For instance, Lassalle's motive for exploring North America probably had its roots in his desire to travel to China. And as Sarah Chapman mentioned yesterday in her talk, that the Bernoux and the René circle that's sponsoring Lassalle, you mentioned that when you actually look at this history from their perspective, you notice that going to China remains one of their main priorities. That's something that people don't talk about. So we see that continuity, perhaps, of the search for China. We also can appreciate how he defended himself against accusations that he was mentally unstable by mobilizing discourses from a local dispute in his native Normandy. Shifting our focus to Lassalle's clerical identity may also help us study him in other ways. I believe, for instance, it'll help us discover new sources. In writing this paper, I became aware of an important gap in Rochemontai's work. While he describes Lassalle's letter requesting permission to leave the Jesuit order, he does not quote nor reproduce any section of that letter. Does that letter even exist? Or does Rochemontais infer its contents from Olivat's response to it? What was Olivat's response? Rochemontais quotes 2 sentences from this, but the rest of the letter, we really don't know what was said. So until we do further research into the Jesuit archives, we really don't know why Lassalle left the Jesuit order. A focus on Lassalle's clerical identity may also help us with the question of authenticating his sources. Doubts have been raised about Lassalle's authorship of that report to Bernoux in 1681. In an analysis of the Monsol affair, which is an episode in Lassalle's report involving his negotiations with the Illinois tribes, the literary scholar Catherine Brouet has discovered that Lassalle described himself in the first person as participating in conversations for which he was not even present. Brouet believes that sections of Lassalle's report reflected the experience and writings of Louis Hennepin, the Recollet priest who accompanied Lassalle on his trip. Lassalle sent Hennepin off on unofficial side trips to the west of the Mississippi to look for that passage to China on his behalf. Brouet believes that Hennepin negotiated with the Illinois tribes at the time of the Monsol episode, but that Lassalle took credit for it in his report. It's sort of like, professors in the sciences who publish research on the work of their graduate students. It was under his authority, but he writes it as himself. Her thesis is plausible, given that Lassalle describes in his letter to Bernoux how he spent months compiling and copying his field reports to write his report back to France, and he very well could have incorporated the reports and notes kept by others in his expedition party. Brouet's research opens the possibility that Hennepin composed the section in Lassalle's letter about the Hermitage and his mental health. But rather than detracting from my argument that we should focus on Lassalle's clerical identity, I think her work strengthens it. And to get to the question of the bottom of the question of authorship of writings attributed to Lassalle, we must pay closer attention to Lassalle's writings by comparing them to those of another priest, Louis Hennepin. To conclude, Lassalle's work as an explorer has its roots in his career as a Jesuit. Although he left the Jesuit order, his goals and training as a cleric continued to shape his actions and works later in life. Scholars have long been divided over Lassalle's legacy, and there remains many questions about his life and writings that remain a mystery. Examining him through the lens of his clerical identity may put us on the right path to finding some new answers. Thank you.